It was 3148, and the first prince of the Federated Sons had just fallen in battle, just months after his official coronation. First Prince Julian Davion, last of his line, had no surviving heirs to take up the mantle in his stead. When New Syrtis was attacked in 3148 by a vengeful force of retribution, Julian would suffer a betrayal that would see his formidable Templar III reduced to ruin. In the years leading up to the Ilclan Era, the Federated Sons had many more battles to fight, and this is the story of one that almost ended the legacy of House Davion before it had a chance to set the Sons back on the path to recovery. Shortly after the coronation ceremony that saw Julian Davion ascend the throne in March of 3147, Julian conferred with his advisors. Although Eric Sandoval, the prince's champion, had been seeing progress with his task force Percival raids in obtaining more material for the war effort, it would not be enough for a full-scale attack on New Avalon, which was still held in the clutches of the Draconis Combine. Operation Cerberus had been formed, consisting of numerous mercenary units, in addition to the armed forces of the Federated Sons, but had yet to be given a target, and the first prince deliberated on what that target should be. Lacking the strength to move on New Avalon directly, a move would need to be made that would bolster the Federated Sons' lagging economy, as well as provide a visible triumph to boost morale. But Julian was troubled. In the year prior, he had finally negotiated a ceasefire with the Capellan Confederation, navigating the delicate situation with Denai, Leao, Centrilla, after a decisive but bloody victory in the skies over Marlette. Despite this, he listened to the counsel of his advisors and made the decision to break the treaty. The economy of the Federated Sons was in tatters. It needed a boost of morale, something to tack together their shattered sense of national pride. It needed a win. Julian's council advocated for a strike upon a Curitan-held planet, such as Robinson or New Avalon itself. Julian considered this, but refused. The dragon would be expecting that. They already existed in a state of war with each other. A strike upon the Capellan Confederation, however, now that would make the most sense. With their backs fully turned, believing that Julian would honor the ceasefire they had negotiated, and with their attention fully on the Republic of the Sphere, they made for a ripe target. Refusing to delegate the operation to any of his subordinates, insisting that it was his burden to shoulder, he took control of Task Force Cerberus himself. He reasoned that since he was the one to broker the peace, it was his responsibility to bear the dishonor of breaking it. This was not his only reasoning, but the other reasons were cards held close to the First Prince's chest, at least for now. Cerberus split into 3 smaller task forces at New Damascus and prepared. Many mercenary commands were at the end of their original contracts, but lucrative offerings from the Davion negotiators did much to bring them back to the table. It was a calculated gamble, as the Davion coffers were running dangerously low, but one Julian made without hesitation. More than a victory, the Federated Sons needed justice at any cost. Three prongs of Task Force Cerberus departed from Federated Sun space in the fall of 3147. The first to make planetfall was nicknamed Chimera, and touched down on Hobson in November. Consisting of a regiment of the Dawn Guards, as well as a cobbled-together regiment of various mercenary commands, the attacking force looked to be overwhelming for the paltry Home Guard forces in the Hobson system. The Home Guard clearly knew this. Opting to go to ground and conduct a guerrilla campaign, warrior House Kamata led the resistance efforts. These efforts would prove fruitless. The calls for reinforcement were declined, citing that the Cian commonality was under attack from multiple fronts, and instructing the Home Guard to simply hold as long as possible. The other prongs of Task Force Cerberus were making headway, and there were simply no reinforcements to give. The next target was Tegeta, aiming to cut off any chance at reinforcement on New Syrtis. provincial capital of the Capellan March, and one of the ultimate goals of this strike. Disaster struck for Task Force Chimera when the dropships ferrying battle mechs to the surface met the Liao air defense. Two such dropships, carrying the Fortune-able mercenary command under the purview of Task Force Chimera, were forced to make a hard combat drop due to the resulting damage inflicted by the air defenses. Although brave and resulting in many units making it to the ground safely, if a little shaken, this reaction resulted in the units of Fortune-able being spread across vast distances and unable to regroup fully. This delayed Fortune-able during the regrouping process. Unable to wait for their companion regiment to reform, the Dawn Guards fought alone. The Liao forces took advantage of the regrouping mercenaries, cornering them in favorable engagements and siphoning off Dawn Guard units one by one. This did not continue for long, however. Once Fortune-able was able to reunite with the Dawn Guards, the Capellan Dynasty Guards were swept away in short order, already weakened by their continued actions against Fortune-able. It was early December when the remaining stragglers received the order from their chancellor to abandon the planet. Chimera claimed Tagata on the 5th of that month. The second head of the three-pronged attack, Task Force Orthus, faced a significantly harder campaign. Already alerted to the Federated Sun's offensive due to the actions of Task Force Chimera, Orthus first jumped to Binley in November of 3147. Forces consisting of the Fortune Baker mercenaries, the 5th Crucius Lancers, and the aerospace assets of the 5th all fell upon the Harlock Raiders en route to the planetary capital of Queensland, scattering the defenders after a deft flanking maneuver by the 5th. They soon found that this was not a retreat. Constant guerrilla fighting and ambushes slowed the advance of Orthus forces as they pressed on, the Raiders bent on winning a protracted war of attrition. It was a full week before the mercenaries of Fortune Baker finally broke the line and advanced into Queensland, triggering the full retreat of the Harlock Raiders from the planet. In yet another surprise attack, the aerospace assets of the Raiders stayed behind, destroying several 5th Crucius dropships as the Federated Suns departed the system. Ground down as they were, the forces of Task Force Orthus faced further adversity when they touched down on Jaipur a week later. The CCAF was waiting. When the task force touched down, they unloaded an arsenal of artillery, aerospace bombardment, and emplacement fire. The ferocity of this concerted attack was so great that the remaining dropships opted to lift off again immediately after disembarking their forces, rather than risk destruction and leaving the forces stranded. With the relative security of the dropships gone, the 5th Crucius Lancers and Fortune Baker had no logistical train to support them, making their trek across the planet's surface all the more punishing. The situation deteriorated further when Orthus' remaining dropships got caught out by the CCAF interceptors, truly marooning the Federated Sun's forces on the planet. The survivors could do little else but dig in and try to hold as long as possible, hopeful that another arm of Operation Cerberus would come back for them. They held firm well into December, but their supplies and morale were dwindling fast, despite the lack of decisive conflict. In fact, there were few battles between the CCAF defenders and the survivors of Orthus, save for a few depot raids to sustain the Fed Sun forces. Task Force Orthus would have to wait. The third arm of the task forces to break the Capellan Fed Sun's armistice, Task Force Hydra, was composed of the most elite units and was tasked with hitting the most hardened targets and taking on the most risk. The reason for this was simple. Julian Davion himself was to lead this task force, and he would let no other shoulder the majority of the burden while he had a say in the matter. Despite his advisor's counsel that this was a particularly bad idea, he did not relent. It was his burden to bear. The 1st Davion Guards, the 1st and 2nd Davion Auxiliaries, as well as multiple small mercenary outfits that had been formed into Fortune Charlie, served as the bulk of this task force. The Davion Guards were fresh and trim, having just refit their forces on Remagen. Now was the time to strike. Their goal? To cut off any attempt at reinforcement from the anti-Spinward, or Galactic West, provinces of the Capellan Confederation. By severing this thumb into Federated Sun space, they hope to isolate their true goal, the occupied Capellan March capital of New Syrtis. In early November of 3147, Atlas was beset by the forces of Hydra. As expected, the planet was well defended by the CCAF. The 2nd St. Ives Lancers were planicide and were determined to be a problem, one that Julian hoped to solve with liberal application of artillery and airstrikes. The Lancers had dug in well, however, so these bombardments did little to dislodge the defenders, instead driving them to dig in even deeper. The 2nd was confident that they would have help arriving soon, and fought furiously. But that fervor waned as the days dragged on. Under the full weight of the biggest task force yet seen on this front, the CCAF force began to wilt. They lasted 3 days. On the 3rd, after particularly fierce fighting between the 1st Davion Guards and the Lancers realized that they would not be seeing reinforcements arrive in time. Rather than throw their lives away, they opted to retreat, pulling off the planet. By mid-November, Hydra had already arrived at its next target. Narellan was defended heartily as well, but this did little to stem the tide. Another element of the 2nd St. Ives Lancers, as well as the warrior house Amara, did what they could in the face of such overwhelming numbers, using their learned knowledge of the local terrain to isolate elements of Task Force Hydra. Sometimes these elements were as small as a single lance, picked apart, mech by mech. It was speculated that these tactics, like those on Atlas, were just a stalling tactic, meant to delay the inevitable just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Like Atlas, none ever showed. These tactics would be repeated on Hydra's next target, Avigalt, with the same result. Maybe these Capellans never heard of the definition of insanity before, or maybe they didn't care. Regardless, the failure of this strategy to bring reinforcements to this new front forced the CCAF forces to withdraw back across their own lines and back into Capellan territory. With the door shut behind them, Julian Davion now turned his forces back spinward, or Galactic East. Elements of the other task forces that could afford to disengage coalesced, meeting Task Force Hydra on Tagata to prepare for their end goal. Now a whopping 7 whole regiments, 4 Davion and 3 mercenary, this task force was called Task Force Styx. At the beginning of December, Task Force Styx began its invasion of the New Syrtis system. The Capellan March capital would be under the Federated Sun's banner again, or it would be ash. Julian Davion would see to that personally if it didn't kill him first. It was December 4th, 3147, when the first elements of Task Force Styx appeared at the pirate jump points of the New Syrtis system. They burned hard for the planet, and fought through to deliver the 5th Crucius Lancers to their drop zones across the New Syrtis continent of Mawradog, and also the planetary capital of Sasso. These forces were not uncontested. The 1st and the 4th Mechwarrion's armored cavalry opposed the Lancers, as well as the remnants of the Dynasty Guard and Warrior House Kamata that had retreated in the wake of Task Force Chimera in the month prior. Although repaired and refit with material stockpiled on the Capellan March capital, there was question to the intensity of their fighting spirit that remained. But the Capellans were acting under edicts direct from the Chancellor Dao Shin Liao himself, stealing their resolve. When the 1st Davion Guards touched down, this was the first time Julian Davion had set foot on the Capellan March capital in years. He was raised here as a boy, under the careful stewardship of both the former First Prince Harrison Davion and the Duchess of New Syrtis, Amanda Hasek, who had acted like the mother he had never known. The last image Julian could recall of this place was the footage he had received of the execution of the Duchess, by order of the madman Dao Shin Liao. The Duchess had knelt, calm but defiant, as she was beheaded publicly at the foot of the Sasso State House. In his journals, Julian would recant. Revenge is such a pedestrian word. This is beyond mere vengeance. This is putting things right. Task Force Styx was large enough that several targets were selected for simultaneous attack to stretch the defending forces as thinly as possible. The 5th Crucius Lancers and the 1st Davion Auxiliary were deemed sufficient to secure the Hassek family's ducal mansion, a fortified position that would serve as a suitable base of command, as well as a necessary boost to the morale if taken. The 59th Striker and 2nd Auxiliary were tasked with the capture of the Sasso spaceport to further isolate defenders as well as secure logistical lines. The 12th was ordered to take the governmental building and admin offices of Sasso. Finally, the 1st Davion Guards and the mercenary commands of Fortune Charlie were to assault the Cave. The Cave was a command center built underground, hardened and fortified to repel attackers. Julian would delegate the leadership of this task to no other, personally taking command of this part of the operation. When the 5th Crucius Lancers arrived at the Hassek estate, the evacuation by the CCAF had already begun. The Dynasty Guard attempted to serve as the rear guard for this evacuation, led by Sangshao Eliza Zhao. This shrewd Capellan commander held little regard for the rich history of the ducal estate. This was immediately apparent when she baited the 5th into a close quarters fight around the estate, before flattening the entire area with as much artillery as she could muster. En route to their objective, the 1st Davion Guards reacted strongly to a seemingly isolated incident, but one that set a disturbing precedent. While traversing an area known as the Drifts, a Capellan ambusher attacked, only targeting a single mech before slipping away from the resulting pursuers. The disconcerting fact was that the target was Julian Davion's Templar III, nicknamed Arthur. This implied that the Capellans possessed an unusual amount of precision in their intel. It was a troubling thought that Julian had to file away at the time. The 1st MAC held out admirably in defense of the Sasso spaceport, seemingly repulsing the 59th Strikers' attempts to push them out. Several attempts were made to penetrate the Mechwarrior lines, but were thrown back readily, leading the Strikers to request reinforcement. For unknown reasons, Julian held back the 2nd Auxiliary in reserve, rather than commit them to the Strikers' aid. In fact, many mercenary units were being picked off piecemeal while attempting to reach their targets. Elements of Fortune Charlie were beset by Capellans en route to the cave, but Federated Sun's controllers urged them to disengage and continue to their destination rather than take the bait. Grumbles of favoritism passed through the mercenaries, but they did as they were bid. Some felt that Julian was prioritizing AFFS lives over those of the mercenaries. Casualties sustained during the orbital drop operation to the mercenary forces further cemented this ideal in some minds. None of the mercs had signed up to be cannon fodder. Contrary to this sentiment, however, the forces of the 5th Crucius Lancers provided cover for Fortune Charlie and allowed them to safely disengage and continue to their target. Upon reaching the cave, Julian Davion and his Davion Guards found it significantly more fortified than the Fed Sons had left it. The Capellan forces had prepared for an eventual attack on the Capellan March capital, installing additional weapon emplacements and fortifications. The battle commenced with recon units decimating emplaced infantry, heavier units trading missile barrages at range, and artillery emplacements opening fire from top of the ridge to lend more power to the Capellan defense. Even more alarming, the Capellan aerospace assets broke through and lined up with an attack run. Each was laden with explosives, capable of completely collapsing the entrance to the cave. Alternatively, they were just as capable of severing the head of the Davion offensive. Luckily, elements of Fortune Charlie were posted up in the area surrounding the cave entrance, and one particular pilot in a 70-ton Flamberge led an anti-aircraft attack from the ground that swatted this airspace from the skies. Once the entrance was secured, Julian ordered Fortune Charlie to act as a rear guard, while the 1st Davion delved deep into the mountain. He aimed to dig out the Capellan worms infesting this mountain complex. As the 1st Davion Guard painstakingly cleared tunnels, often fighting section by section, sweeping mines or traps, and breaking through choke points, elements of Fortune Charlie moved into the gaps. The fighting lulled, which made Julian Davion uneasy. The Capellans had put up such a fierce fight that their sudden absence made the gloom deafening. Charlie 3 was the designation used by Major Tallulah Zhang in a massive Shrike battlemech. When Julian tasked Charlie 3 in her XO, piloting a flamberge, with covering a flank, his orders were met only with a dull static. In the midst of the gloom, shouts came over Julian's comms that the 4th Mechwarrion's armored cavalry forces were closing in fast. Assuming they were trying to catch him out in a tactical maneuver, Julian barely realized the reality of the situation before it dropped on him. The Shrike, positioned perfectly to the rear of his Templar 3, vaporized his relatively thin rear armor and became the knife in his back. It dawned on him as he wrestled with the controls of his mech that all the damage these Fortune Charlie mechs had sustained had only come from their combat drop. Otherwise, they didn't have a single scratch on them from the fighting. He had been betrayed. One member of this Fortune Charlie outfit did not agree with these actions. Captain Mallory Faulkner was a clan descendant that had found herself in mercenary employment by circumstance. This betrayal was beneath her. She only wanted to fight, not be a cowardly backstabber. Capellan money be damned. This was the epitome of dishonor. If you know only one thing about the clans, let it be that they care a lot about their honor. Worse yet, breaching a contract meant that they'd never work as mercenaries again after a betrayal of this magnitude. They'd have to be Capellan wage slaves. White-hot rage took over. Instead of firing upon the first prince, Faulkner instead turned her guns on her major's unprotected rear armor covering the Shrike. In the ensuing brawl, Faulkner charged the heavier battlemech with her flamberge. The two mechs grappled in a brief exchange of blows, but the fight ended with Faulkner crumpling the Shrike's cockpit with a crushing battlemech claw. In the frantic firefight following this fracas, the 5th Crucius Lancers flooded the facility to facilitate the fortification of the First Prince's forces. They had abandoned the ducal residence after its destruction, instead coming to the First Prince's aid. Hastened when they had learned of the closing trap. They had successfully pushed back the attacking Mechwarrion's armored cavalry, as well as the traitorous elements of Fortune Charlie. Mallory Faulkner surrendered, allowing herself to be captured. Amazingly, although he had sustained some truly horrific damage by this betrayal, the First Prince's Templar still stood. He had narrowly escaped assassination by a Capellan-bought mercenary leader. Decisions made about traitors would have to wait. Now denied their secondary command location, the Capellans only became more desperate and ferocious. Eliza Zhao, the Capellan commander, was too caught up in an engagement with the 2nd Davion auxiliary units to notice the impending danger until it was too late. A 100-ton Devastator mech obliterated hers with Gauss rifle slugs, leaving her to die riddled with shrapnel and face down in the mud of the battlefield. The fight for New Syrtis was all but won. Guerrilla fighters would continue to harass the Davion forces on planet in the coming months, but the Capellan March capital was back under Federated Sun's control. This was a cause for celebration. The mercenaries, however, were not celebrating. To the contrary, many felt that the First Prince had used them as human shields for his own AFFS forces. For her valor, Mallory Faulkner was inducted into the AFFS, assuming a role in fighting the clandestine Capellan forces left on planet. Despite the victory of reclaiming a March capital and its surrounding systems, Julian found himself the target of backlash. His perceived treatment of the mercenaries, as well as the perceived neglect of the Draconis Combine front, earned him some ire among the common folk. Many chafed that New Avalon, capital of the Federated Suns, remained in the clutches of the Dragon, while Julian pursued an underhanded attack against those he had just brokered peace with. The prince's champion, Eric Sandoval, was seen in a contrasting light. Due to his multiple successes and lack of responsibility in the selection of targets, he was thought to be a champion of the people as much as he was a champion for the first prince. This endeared him to many. It appeared that his popularity was on course to rival, if not outright eclipse, that of the first prince. Among high command, lines began to form. Dissent spread. Although both men were loyal only to the Federated Sons, neither man could agree on all strategic decisions, leading to an even further division amongst the nation's leadership. In a rare show of compromise between the leaders of the nation, Julian agreed to relinquish his battlefield and strategic command to his prince's champion, further elevating his status. Meanwhile, the months passed while the remnants of Task Force Cerberus rearmed and refit. The low-intensity conflict on New Syrtis continued like the last embers of a fire. The Capellan March capital for the Federated Sons was simply too important of a target to let go so easily, so the Capellan Chancellor Daoshin Liao finally was forced into action. He would reclaim this system at any cost to prevent further Davion aggression into Confederation territory. Maskarovka intelligence assets were still remaining on New Syrtis, and they upped the ante with a terror attack that would see the release of a potent nerve agent. This catastrophic attack would kill upwards of 200,000 citizens on New Syrtis, including the newly appointed planetary governor. Terror attacks continued, with citizens being drugged from their homes in the night to be butchered in the streets. No sign of their attackers remaining by morning. The 1st Davion Guards and the 5th Crucius Lancers struggled to keep the peace as murderous mobs began killing anybody exhibiting even the slightest suspicious behavior. The situation was set to spiral out of control. Julian, hoping to calm fears and personally put an end to the attacks, touched down planetside in August of 3148. His arrival seemed to only complicate matters. Soon after touching down, attackers began a full-fledged assault aiming to secure the Sasso spaceport. Originally thought to be Death Commandos by their distinctive black paint, the attacking force was later found to be a remnant of the Thuggee cult of Confederation history, known for their fanatical devotion to the Chancellor and to the Hindu goddess Kali. These well-trained and fanatical forces ripped through the battle lines of the 5th Crucius Lancers guarding the spaceport, prompting Julian to lead his 1st Davion Guard in a sortie in response. This is just what they wanted. Bursting through a pirate point near New Syrtis Moon, Capellan forces suddenly appeared in system, immediately disgorging their troop carriers and burning hard for the planet. There was little time to organize the defense, and nearly 3 full regiments of Capellan mechs made planetfall. Among them, one of the most fearsome mechs in existence, Yinlo Wang, fabled mount of the Capellan heroes past, this time piloted by none other than Denai Centrilla Liao, the very noble whose trust was most broken by Julian's transgressions. The fighting was pitched. Most of the mercenaries Julian had relied on before were tied up in posts guarding the other systems taken in Operation Cerberus, and there were little reinforcements to call upon. In an unexpected twist, the citizens of New Syrtis rebelled against the invaders at every turn, incensed by the reckless violence visited upon the citizenry in the prior terror attacks, slowing the Capellans' ability to seize critical objectives. A series of tit-for-tat battles ensued, both sides unwilling to commit to an all-or-nothing assault. 2 weeks of fighting wore down both sides, but the numerical superiority of the invading force was taking its toll on the defenders. The militia they had quickly raised was hardly a boon to the battered 5th Crucius Lancers and the remnants of the 1st Davion Guard, and they were rapidly depleting their supplies. Without a properly working HPG to get the word out, there was no guarantee of rescue on their way for them either. Morale waned. Although many doubted Julian's strategic ability, none could contest his effect on morale. Had he not shown up, this fight would have long been over. Still, slow attrition was not an attractive fate. It was time to bring an end to this. Better to take to the field with even a splinter of hope than to let that hope shrivel up and die. The battle raged, taking up position at the same place that the second Davion auxiliaries had triumphed over the former Capellan commander. The forces under Julian's command prepared to make a final effort, one last push to finish the 3 regiments of CCAF and 3 companies of Death Commandos, one of the most feared commands in the entire Inner Sphere. As the battle reached its most fevered pitch, lights began descending from overhead. Just in time, the Dawn Guard had arrived. Now acutely aware of how little time was left to secure a victory of any kind, Denai sought out Julian Davion's Templar on the battlefield. Her famous centurion, Yinlo Wang, zeroed in on his battle mech, and she called for an aerospace strike on his position. Heavy ordnance carried by the strike craft fell slowly, but much faster than a battle mech could run, much less the lumbering mount that Julian piloted. Mallory Faulkner, now a lieutenant, was present to watch the bombs fall. After months of fighting on this planet, her Flamberge was in rough shape. The actuator damage that she had sustained in the initial operation to retake the planet had never fully been resolved, so she was helpless to prevent the coming tragedy. The bombs all but annihilated the Davion's Templar, but it yet remained standing after the blasts had faded, if only just. The following artillery bombardment would rectify that. It disappeared in a cacophony of explosions and geysers of dirt and smoke. Enraged, Faulkner engaged the Yinlo Wang as it approached Arthur's smoking wreckage. She led her lance in a charge, best she could, but Denai skillfully wielded the infamous Centurion like no one else could. Faulkner fell to Yinlo Wang's hatchet, buying just enough time for the Davion forces to push back against the Capellans and secure the smoldering Templar's wreck. Inside, Julian somehow clung to life. Twisted and pierced by the remains of his mech, he lost consciousness, unsure if he'd ever wake. Without an heir, the Davion lineage would end with him if he died. Luckily for the Davion lineage, he survived. The endosteel frame that had buckled and crushed his leg had also stifled his bleeding, allowing for a medtech team to extricate him from the wreckage in the wake of the Capellan attack. His injuries were severe enough that amputation was warranted, and he lost his left leg below the knee, as well as several of his fingers. But he was alive. Knowing that victory was within their grasp, the Davion forces were inspired to even more ferocious attacks. After a few weeks of facing a determined and now reinforced enemy, Denai Centrella Liao, leading the 2nd Mechwarrior Armored Cavalry, petitioned for a second meeting between Julian Davion and herself. She knew the strategic situation was now untenable. Even if they did win this war and retake New Syrtis, she would lack the forces to hold the planet, even less so with the entire populace rebelling against Capellan rule. Mirroring the events on Marlette, the two met at a neutral location. The first prince picked the most suitable location, the State House Square in Sasso, the very place where the former Duchess had been executed, and within full view of the devastation caused by the Death Commando's nerve agent attack. Julian was not the man she remembered when they met. He was now wheelchair-bound due to his injuries, but this had not quelled his spirit. Denai was angry with him for breaking their truce, and Julian admitted that she was right to feel so, but he would not apologize. His actions were for the good of his nation. Ultimately, the negotiations secured the Federated Suns holdings they had captured during Operation Cerberus. More importantly, the threat of the Republic made a peace brokerage between the Confederation and the Suns even more vital. Denai and Julian, in the interests of their respective nations, finally put an end to the wars plaguing the two realms. Each had other wars to fight. Denai leveraged her position as both the Chancellor's sister and ambassador, and agreed to the terms. Peace had been won. The cost had been high. The first prince had not made it out unscathed. Denai faced censure as the Chancellor resisted the cessation of hostilities, but ultimately Daoshin could not afford to continue the war. Hostilities along the border ceased, for the moment. Taking the Capellan March capital was a gamble. By taking New Syrtis, the Davion First Prince had sacrificed much. If Devlin Stone's promised aid would not come in their hour of need, they may lose their chance to retake New Avalon for good. That would spell the end of the Federated Sons as a nation. Robinson also remained in the clutches of the dragon, marking yet another March capital lost to the Federated Sons. All the while, Eric Sandoval's stock was yet on the rise. As his victories continued to mount, and public perception of him reached even greater heights, whispers began that it might be time for a name other than Davion to bear the title of the first prince of the Federated Sons.